Next Thursday is Lincoln's birthday. On a cold, snowy morning, 144 years ago next Thursday, Thomas Lincoln, the wandering carpenter, left his cabin on Sinking Creek and shuffled through the snow to the cabin of his wife's aunt, Betsy Sparrow. And when the door was opened, he said, "Betsy Sparrow, Nancy's got a boy baby." Betsy gathered a few things together and followed Tom back through the snow to the nativity cabin on Sinking Creek. He wrapped the baby up in a yellow blanket, stewed some berries with honey for the young mother, spread things up around the cabin a little, and went back to her own cabin. That was the beginning. The ending came 56 years later. In the brick house on 10th Street, the sound of the heavy breathing from the giant who was stretched across the bed there came to an end. The Secretary of War, the grim Stanton, touched Dr. Dorley, the pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, where I shall deliver the Lincoln address next Thursday night, touched him on the shoulder and said, "Dr. Dorley, lead us in prayer." When the prayer was finished, he turned to the window and pulled down the blinds to shut out the April morning sunlight. And then turning to the still form upon the bed, he said, "Now he belongs to the ages." So it was more than an ending, you see. It was also a beginning. Some of the historians debate and dispute as to whether or not Stanton said that. The latest account that I came across, and a very good one, is that what he said was this: he is a man for the ages. But whether Stanton said he belongs to the ages or not, or whether he said anything at all, makes no difference. There's no doubt as to the truth of what he was alleged to have said, that he belongs to the ages. One of the best ways to measure a man is to look at him through the window of the men around him and closely associated with him. Between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, when he had his office in the State House at Springfield, a friend coming in to see him saw coming down the steps the stately form of the governor of Ohio, Salmon P. Chase. When this man came into Lincoln's office, he said, "I hope you're not going to put that man in your cabinet." "Why not?" said Lincoln. "Because he thinks he's a bigger man than you are." "Well," Lincoln said, "do you know any other men who think they're bigger than I am?" "I'm not sure," said this visitor. "But why do you ask that?" "Because I want to put all of them in my cabinet." All of the 7 men whom Lincoln called into his cabinet, with one exception, the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, who did about as good a job as any of them and better than some of them. All of them already were national figures. 4 of them were rivals of Lincoln for the nomination and received good votes in the Chicago Convention. These were Bates, the Attorney General of Missouri, and Cameron of Pennsylvania, Secretary of War, author of the definition of a good politician, one who, when he is bought, stays bought. And the third case, the Secretary of the Treasury, and then the great William H. Seward. Seward was the author of a phrase that rang through the nation when he made a reply to Daniel Webster's compromising speech in the Senate, when he seemed to go back on all his anti-slavery principles. Seward said there is a higher law than the Constitution. He did not mean that the Constitution and the moral law were in conflict, but that they were in agreement, and that the highest law was the moral law. And then in 1858, 6 months before Lincoln used the figure of the House divided against itself, Seward, speaking at Rochester, described the conflict between the two interests and the two sections of the country as the irrepressible conflict which would decide whether the nation would remain half slave and half free, or all slaves and all free. When the Chicago Convention met, Seward was the outstanding leader of the new Republican Party. He had been governor of New York twice and was in the Senate. Everyone expected, North and South, that he would be the man to be nominated. On the first ballot, he was more than 100 votes ahead of Lincoln. On the next ballot, the second, he lost considerable ground. On the third ballot, Lincoln was nominated. How do you account for that extraordinary overthrow? First of all, the enmity of the editor of the Tribune, who got into the convention, Horace Greeley, as a delegate from Oregon in some way, although he came from New York. And then the feeling in some quarters that if Seward were nominated, he could not carry Pennsylvania and Indiana, key states, because of a favorable attitude he had taken towards the Catholics and parochial schools when he was governor of New York. And third, and perhaps the controlling factor, the shrewd political dealers that backed Lincoln in that convention, Judd and Davis and Meadow, and who bargained with Pennsylvania that if Pennsylvania gave her vote to Cameron, he would be made Secretary of the Treasury. Lincoln afterwards repudiated that, but made him Secretary of War, and bargained with Indiana that if Caleb Smith were made Secretary of the Interior, which he was, Indiana would swing her vote for Lincoln. That's the way it happened. The cannon was on the lawn at the mansion of Seward at Auburn, New York, and the crowd had gathered ready to fire that cannon, but the cannon was never fired. The wire came through, Lincoln nominated. Only once did Seward show his great disappointment. That was when a congressman, was pressing Karl Schurz, the noted German-American patriot, for the post of ambassador to Spain, and said if he were not appointed, he would be greatly disappointed. Seward sprang to his feet and walked up and down and said, "Disappointed, disappointed. You talk to me about being disappointed, who by all rights should have been President of the United States and had to step aside for a little Illinois lawyer." The night, or a few days before the inauguration, Lincoln gave Seward a copy of his inaugural address. It came to a very abrupt conclusion. With you is the question, shall it be peace or war? Seward said that's too severe, too abrupt. Close with something conciliatory. Lincoln said, "Well, you write out a paragraph for me." He wrote out 2 paragraphs and submitted them to him the next day. The one that he selected was one in which Seward used the metaphor of cords of memory that stretch from the battlefields of the past and would again harmonize in the chorus of the Union. Lincoln took that paragraph, used the same metaphor, some of the same words, but with his genius transmuted it to purest gold, perhaps his greatest passage in prose. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot's grave to every home and hearthstone in this wide nation will yet swell the chorus of the Union when touched again, as surely they will be touched by the angels of our better nature. Abraham Lincoln entered Washington the victim of a profound delusion. Standing on the balcony of the old Monongahela House, and he spoke here on his way to Washington. He pointed across the river. Of course, it was Virginia, just 30 miles over then. He said, "Our friends over the river are unduly excited. There is no crisis except such as is being stirred up by unprincipled men." He said that when already, I think, 5 or 6 states were out of the Union, and the drums were rolling in every county seat of every state in the South. It was the hope of Lincoln, with his kind heart, that conciliatory measures and conciliatory speech would yet hold the Union and the nation together. Now, in a sense, he was correct when he said that the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot's grave, would yet swell the chorus of the Union. They did indeed one day swell the chorus of the Union, but not until they were stretching from over 500,000 graves that had not yet been dug upon the battlefields of the South and the North. There's a book, very able book too, Lincoln Finds a General. I think the 2nd or 3rd volume is now out. Deals with Grant, of course. But the truth is, Lincoln didn't find Grant. Lincoln let successive victories, Belmont, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, sanguinary Shiloh, pass without a word of thanks or recognition of Grant, except formal advancement in rank, which came through his great backer in Congress, Washburn. If any man found Grant, it was Elihu Washburn, the congressman from Galena, Illinois, who was responsible for his every promotion. What found Grant was the blood and fire and thunder of the battlefield. Then the cunning man arrived. We have been in a situation in our country that seems altogether different from the great crisis of the 60s. Then it was one section of the country against another, a revolution, and nothing underground about it. We knew, those in the North, who the enemies were. Today you hardly know. How many are there here in Pittsburgh today who secretly are wishing and plotting to see this republic overthrown? We read of these trials in New York and one here in Pittsburgh. One after another, groups of men convicted, sometimes technically of perjury, but really because they lied about their association with the communist underground conspirators. What we need then is a great and new faith in the permanence and in the divine destiny of this republic. When the end was at hand, Lincoln went down to Grant's headquarters at City Point to visit him. And they were talking together there around the campfire in the cool April evening, Lincoln relating some of his characteristic humorous anecdotes. And then Grant took his cigar out of his mouth and said to the President, "Mr. President, was there ever a time when you had any doubt as to the outcome of this struggle?" Lincoln was silent for a moment, and then, raising himself up in his camp chair and lifting his arm, he said with the most solemn emphasis, "No, never for a moment." That was the greatest thing in Lincoln's service to the nation. He never despaired of the republic, even in its darkest hours. St. John said, you know, that if all the things that were written about Jesus, all the things that he said and did were written, the world itself, speaking rhetorically, could hardly contain the books that should be written. Well, if all the books that have been written about Lincoln were gathered together here, this church and this chapel could hardly contain them. But of all those things, I know nothing that brings me closer to the spirit and meaning of Lincoln than what I read one August day in one of my first Civil War expeditions, more than 40 years ago now, on the wall of the Lodge in the cemetery on the battlefield of Antietam, the bloodiest day of the Civil War. The eyes of Lincoln, sad eyes that were patient and tender, sad eyes that were steadfast and true, and warm with the unchanging splendor of courage no ills could subdue, eyes dark with the dread of the morrow, and woe for the day that was gone, the sleepless companions of sorrow, the watchers that witnessed the dawn. Eyes tired from the clamor and goading, and dim with the stress of the years, and followed by pain and foreboding, and strained by repression of tears. Sad eyes that were wearied and blighted with visions and sieges of war, now watch o'er a country united from the luminous slopes of the stars. Now have we another song, Mr. Henry? Our nation, bless the President of the United States. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen.